Alrighty, history fans, welcome to another exciting edition of History 102, and welcome to the second lecture where we are here taking a focused look at the role of technology in early 19th century America in the early 1800s. And in this lecture, we're going to turn our focus to the human side of technology, talk about its impact on medicine, health, and diet. And in doing so, we'll talk about the limits of technology in this period. In our previous lecture, we testified to the really transformative, revolutionary impact of technology, a new age of railroads, steamboats, canals, photography, sewing machines, typewriters, a dizzying number of technological advances in this period. But when we turn our attention to the human side of life in this period, medicine, health, you'll see the limits of technology, and we'll end this lecture by talking about a pseudoscience, a false science that develops in this period that also offers us evidence on the other side of how this isn't necessarily such a period of great technological advance. So here in our second lecture, we will turn our attention accordingly to the human side and talk about the limits of technological knowledge in this period. Let's begin that by talking about the impact of technology on everyday life. History is about human beings, and we want to focus on the human side of the story here in this lecture, like changes to one's diet. You don't get any more intimate or human than putting something inside your mouth. So let's talk about the impact of technology on diet. By the 1840s, in urban areas, we're talking about urban areas, not rural areas, you see the first use of coal-burning stoves in American homes rather than wood-burning stoves. And what this allowed for was a more inattentive form of cooking. If you've ever attempted to keep a fire going, a wood fire, you know it takes a lot of attention. You have to constantly add wood, stoke the fire, make sure that the fire continues. It's easier for a fire to die out. It takes a lot of vigilance. But coal as a fuel could burn rather long without that constant attention. And so this led to an inattentive form of cooking, and one in which, with a stove, you could cook a variety of different dishes at once on different portions of that stove rather than the one pot meal that prevailed in the wood burning stoves prior. So this meant a variety of foods could be consumed, which, as we know, is salubrious, is healthy, and also an improved form of cooking, because with these different dishes you could adjust the heat and preserve different textures. In urban areas, people have greater access to a variety of goods with shipments coming in from railroads. And so there's more goods and more different types of vegetables that could be purchased at urban markets. And with the coal-burning stoves, you could cook those items and do so in a way that allowed you a greater variety, greater diversity in one's diet, as well as improved forms of cooking through this style of coal-burning stoves, where you could adjust the heat much better than you could with a wood-burning stove, and then provide different textures and flavors as a result, rather than throwing everything in one pot and leaving it burning, cooking over a wood-burning stove. So in urban areas, you had, by the 1840s, in some homes, these coal-burning stoves, and it's a good example of how technology here affected people in their daily lives, in what they ate, what they put inside their bodies. The stoves themselves were mass-produced, manufactured in factories. They were shipped to cities on railroad cars. Coal was mined using new technologies like the steam shovel, and also sent on railroad lines. So the use of these coal-burning stoves was deeply connected to large trends in technological advance, like railroads, like new mining equipment, the availability of the food that is being cooked, the varieties of different foods. Again, a function of new technologies in this period that allowed for greater productivity in farms and rural areas, And so all of these changes we are enunciating here in this first slide that surround and are a product of the use of coal burning stoves all come from technology. Technology in farming, technology in manufacturing, technology in mining, technology in terms of transportation. And the net result of this was a somewhat better diet for urban dwellers who had access to these stoves and coal as an alternative form of fuel than wood. Let's talk further here about changes to food, diet, and health in America as a result of technology in the early 19th century. As I mentioned, railroads brought in shipments of food from around the country. It's part of the greater efficiencies in the economy in this period, where areas of demand, areas of need could have that demand met through this rapid relay of goods, in this case produce, to people living in cities. Cities needed food to be brought in order for their population to be dedicated to non-food producing efforts like manufacturing. You needed a steady supply of food, and railroads provided that. And as a result of the greater productivity in farming in this period and new technologies like railroads that could quickly rush those agricultural products to market, people again had a more varied diet. And we know that that is key to greater health. Eating a variety of different goods, eating goods that are fresh and in season. And with that, the new technologies of railroads and steamships and the greater productivity of farming in this period, more and more Americans could enjoy fresh vegetables, fresh fruit, things that we know are important to improving health and longevity. Now, there are still seasonal fluctuations in what is available. And also, of course, agriculture, despite the technology of this period, does remain somewhat captive to changes in weather patterns and rainfall. So what you could eat was to some extent still limited, and even now in the 21st century in a globalized food relay system where a lot of what you eat again is produced outside this country, still even in the 21st century we know that only certain goods are available at certain times. Try to find a peach in January, it's hard to find one, right? And so even today, what you eat is to some extent limited based on season. And then another limit to the variety of food available, of course, income. And certainly wealthy Americans had more disposable income for food. This doesn't always mean that they're eating healthier, though, because sometimes they use that extra income to buy products, mostly meat, that was unhealthy. We have seen in the last decade or so increases in gout in Americans. And gout in the 19th century was known as the rich man's disease because it is a product of eating too much meat, where after eating too much meat, you build up certain acids in your body, and it leads to this very painful condition known as gout. And so gout is an example of how if you have a lot of money and you can eat a lot of meat, it isn't necessarily consistent with good health outcomes. We have seen increased incidences of gout here in America in the last decade because we Americans, we love to have 2 or 3 dead animals stacked on top of each other when we eat our food, right? Our bacon pastrami, bacon disaster burgers, wherever the hell they are, right? So today, that's why a lot of people are afflicted by gout in the era of cheap meat available and the ubiquity of fast food and other cheap processed foods. In the 19th century, gout was considered the rich man's disease, and it's exemplary of how being wealthy doesn't necessarily mean that you are going to have better health outcomes if you're spending that extra money pursuing lots of salty meat. But overall, obviously, if you had more money, you would be able to have a greater variety in your diet. You could afford fresh fruits and vegetables, much more so than working class people. So overall, there's more available. There's certainly more abundance in the age of technological advance in farming and agriculture, but class differences persist, where the rich are obviously able to eat better than the poor, where the rich have a more steady and reliable source of caloric intake. Another limit to the improvements to food and diet in this period concerned preservation of spoilage. Before 1860, the ice box is very, very rare. It would only be available to the wealthiest Americans. And you will not see refrigeration until the mid-20th century as a common part of American life. It's really only after World War II that the refrigerator becomes a mainstay of American life. Now, an icebox is different than a refrigerator. A refrigerator has within it a compressor, a machine that pumps cold air into the unit, into the refrigerator. So the refrigerator you have in your home, you don't have to put ice in it to cool things down. It has this compressor that pumps cold air into the unit and keeps your beer, soda, and whatever else cold. Ice boxes were the only form of cooling available inside American homes for food preservation through cooling before refrigeration. And ice boxes, as the name indicates, mean that you have to put ice inside. It doesn't have a compressor. It doesn't have a machine inside that produces cold air. And ice boxes become more popular and common in the late 19th century. And there's a whole ice industry where people are delivering ice to homes and urban areas. Ice men were people tasked with delivering that ice. You could see photographs of the late 19th century of men working on frozen lakes like Lake Michigan right off Chicago, and their job was to cut up the frozen lake to deliver ice to people living in Chicago. So you went out on Lake Michigan in the winter and you cut up the frozen lake, and that was the ice later delivered to homes in Chicago. But that isn't until the late 1800s. So there are no refrigerators until the 20th century, and really there are no refrigerators common in American homes until the late 20th century. And ice boxes might have been available in this period, but they're very rare. And they're a very unreliable source of cooling because you do have to keep that ice inside. So most Americans in the early 1800s relied on salt as a preservative, salting meat in an effort to retard spoilage and preserve that meat. And so many Americans who consumed meat in this period, if they could afford to buy meat, were buying salted meat preserved in that fashion. You may celebrate St. Patrick's Day with some corned beef. That's a common dish consumed on St. Patrick's Day. The corned in corned beef does not refer to maize, corn, the plant that you might eat off the cob. Corn refers to the method of preserving the brisket that we call corned beef in a salty solution. And this was very common in America. That's how corned beef became a mainstay of St. Patrick's Day. They don't eat corned beef in Ireland. St. Patrick's Day, as it's celebrated here in the United States, is really an Irish-American holiday rather than a celebration of Irish culture. And Irish Americans and all Americans in the early 19th century corned their beef and other meat products, meaning preserved them in the salty solution, as a way of preventing spoilage when refrigeration was unavailable and ice boxes were rare and expensive. And eating all that salty meat was bad for one's health. The point about using salt as a preservative is that it's not very healthy to consume that level of sodium. And so the use of salt as a preservative not only speaks to the limits of technology in this period when refrigeration was rare, but it also speaks to how in many ways what people were consuming in their daily lives was very deleterious to their health, very bad for their health. Also, there were all kinds of quackery in this period, all kinds of fad diets and claims regarding certain products that ultimately had no effect on one's health or actually had itself a deleterious impact on oneself. In the 19th century, there's nothing like the FDA. There's no truth in labeling or truth in advertising laws. And so quackery was very common, where people would boast that this product can cure all kinds of diseases and make the blind see, and all kinds of outlandish claims were attached to a variety of products in this period, as well as a number of fad diets that were, again, coming out of self-appointed health gurus like John Harvey Kellogg and C.W. Post, individuals we talked about earlier in a previous lecture. They advocated for vegetarianism. And then, of course, there was the temperance movement in this period, which was the first time in American history where there was this moral judgment attached to consumption of alcohol in an age of industrialization, when employers did not want their workforce to consume alcohol, and certainly not consume alcohol on the job. So there's very limited advice, good, sound advice in this period regarding health and diet. There's a lot of people out there with silly and strange ideas that we now look back on and laugh at. And then there are a lot of fad diets and magic elixirs and all kinds of patent medicines being sold in this period that could be sold because there were no prohibitions against those products. There were no requirements to include an ingredients list, no laws regarding what you could boast and brag about your product. You could have a traveling show, a medicine show as they were known, where you went town to town and you put on some performance and you claim that this tonic, this elixir could again make the blind see, could cure cancer, could cure baldness, and you could get away with it as long as you got out of town before people realized they had been hoodwinked. And so in the 19th century, no regulations regarding what you could say about a product. You could sell these products and say they will cure baldness and blindness and make people who can't walk able to dance the jitterbug and get away with it. Now, a lot of these magic elixirs and products were, first of all, not healthy at all. They offered no health benefits, and a lot of them were actually bad for your health because most of them had a huge alcohol content that was part of their ability to relieve pain or misery by making you feel good for a little while. But consuming those magic elixirs, being captive to these fad diets that often gave you bad advice meant, again, Americans in this period would see little improvement in their health, even with things like coal-burning stoves and greater availability of fresh fruits and vegetables. So it's very much a mixed bag in that way. Some improvement, but of course, other limits to technology in food preservation, and then the way in which Americans were subject to such misinformation in this period and flim-flamming efforts, con artist efforts, that ultimately were deleterious to their health. Another way in which we could see this as a limited period of technological advance, despite the railroads and sewing machines and revolvers and photography in this period, is in regards to health. Very little gains in terms of life expectancy, even as late as 1850, the midpoint of the 19th century. The average lifespan in America was about 40. You only got 40 years on this planet. This was often due to the dangerous working conditions people found themselves laboring in a period where there are no workplace safety laws. There's no such thing as OSHA, inspecting factories to make sure they are safe. A lot of this had to do with poor diet, as we described earlier. Some of the ways in which, despite some improvements, people were still eating in a rather unhealthy fashion. But the main reason why life expectancy was so low in this period was there's no knowledge of germ theory. There's no knowledge of what actually causes disease. And people were living in filth and squalor. They didn't have access to clean running water. They bathed rather rarely. They were clustered together in these tenement buildings without indoor plumbing, without proper air circulation. And so tuberculosis, cholera, a number of terrible, nasty 19th century diseases spread like wildfire in these clustered urban areas. Pandemics were very common in American cities in the 19th century, and so the limited knowledge regarding what causes disease, the limited knowledge regarding sanitary conditions and what's necessary for health plays a key role in the very low life expectancies in this period. So it's an age of railroads, steamboats, cotton gins, McCormick Reapers, an age of photography and six-shot revolvers. Again, wherever you looked, an era of remarkable change where we're blowing up mountains and sending railroads right through them. And yet, life expectancy was about 40. And that's because there was this limited knowledge in regards to health and longevity. High mortality rate for children, 1 in 3 children born to their mothers won't live to see their second birthday. 50% of African American children. This included both free blacks in the North who were not enslaved and slaves in the South. And again, this had to do with the very terrible conditions in which children were born, where they were so vulnerable to infections. Childbirth was very dangerous in the 19th century. It was dangerous for the children and certainly very dangerous for women. That too is a causal factor in the low life expectancy rates in this period. Women often died in childbirth, or they got infected by doctors who would deliver babies without washing their hands, using instruments that they had used on other patients without washing them. So childhood was very precarious, and there was a high infant mortality rate, high child mortality rate, and childbirth itself was very dangerous. And all this, again, a product of the fact that human beings in the 19th century did not know what actually caused disease. They did not have the basic knowledge that we have today about germ theory. Joseph Lister will have to fight his entire life to convince people about germ theory, that there are these invisible animals, bacterium on your hand that cause disease, that washing and sanitizing is necessary. It really isn't until the early 20th century when human beings are finally convinced by the theories of Lister and others. So there's no knowledge of germ theory in this period, no imperative to clean, sanitize, wash one's hands. Going to see a doctor in the 19th century was dangerous. You were better off not going to see a doctor because doctors would treat patients without washing their hands, without washing and sanitizing instruments. By the mid-19th century, though all of these inventions had developed, telegraph, railroad, steamboats, we still had a very medieval knowledge of health and medicine. Going back to the 14 and 1500s, there had been little advance in terms of knowledge regarding health. It's the check, it's the exception to the rule in this period of technological change, not when it comes to health. American physicians were still under the influence of Benjamin Rush, who was one of the signers of the Declaration of Independence and the father of American medicine, who wrote a series of books in the late 1700s regarding health and medicine. And decades later, there's still the common text cited and referenced by physicians. So decades go by, and there's very little change in terms of medical knowledge despite railroads, telegraphs, steamboats. Benjamin Rush was one of the signers of the Declaration of Independence. He is seen as the father of American medicine. His knowledge in the 1700s was, again, rooted in medieval era understanding of human health and disease. And then with his lofty place as this father of American medicine, he wrote a number of textbooks that were used in medical schools, consulted by doctors, well into the mid-1800s. So it's a period where very little knowledge has advanced in regards to health, and people are still consulting the ideas of Rush, who was alive in the late 1700s. That medieval level of knowledge that Rush articulated, expressed, was based on the idea of balancing fluids in one's body. In the medieval period and through the 19th century, health was imagined to be a product of maintaining a balance within the four humors or four fluids in one's body. And the idea was to maintain harmony. If you were afflicted, if you were sick, if you were ill in any way, there was this idea that one of the four humors was excessive and you had to balance it. And that meant bloodletting. This was very common in this period, attaching leeches to people's bodies, opening veins and letting blood pour out, because there was this idea that we've got too much blood and we have to balance it. And so we're going to attach leeches to you. We're going to split your veins open. They would force patients to vomit in an effort to purge them of yellow bile, one of the 4 humors. They were given hot peppers and locked in steam boxes to sort of sweat out that humor, that fluid of one's body. So imagine you're sick in 1845 and you go to see a doctor and you complain of an illness, and his solution to your illness is to attach a leech to you and suck blood out of you, or to force feed you hot peppers, or to make you barf. That was the sort of treatment you would receive, and that's why I said earlier that you were better off not going to a doctor in 1845. You were better off not going to a doctor in the 19th century, because the treatment was often worse than the disease. The treatment made things worse. Imagine taking someone who's sick and forcing them to vomit. Imagine forcing someone who's sick and making them, sweat it out in this way. So this only made the illness worse, and it's very conclusive evidence for us of the very limited understanding in this period regarding disease and health. It may be an age of steamboats and railroads, but we were still with a very medieval understanding of health and medicine. So as I said, one of the products of this approach to health, this idea of balancing different fluids, humors in one's body, was the very common use of bloodletting as a medical treatment in the mid-19th century. Very good evidence here that we are in a medieval mindset when it comes to the body. The influence of Benjamin Rush himself, in many ways influenced by medieval thinkers regarding health, urged American doctors to attach leeches to people's bodies, to open up veins, in an effort to remove what was imagined to be excess blood, and in doing so somehow heal the patient. This was usually common with things like fevers. There's this idea you have too much blood inside you, and it's what's causing the fever. And so you go to see a doctor with a fever, and they cut you open and they just let you bleed, or they attach leeches. You could order leeches and do this at home. You see on the left here a mail order advertisement for cuppers and leechers, and attach these to your body because people believed this was a way of becoming healthy. So this really speaks to the limited knowledge and the theme here in the second lecture about how, as much as this is an era of trains and steamboats and railroads and telegraphs, very limited knowledge in terms of health. Of course, bloodletting did not help the patient and made things worse. So you're already sick, and then when you go to someone who's there tasked with making you feel better, they attach a leech to your body. And the sicker you were, the more intense the illness was, the more blood they would remove from you. So good evidence here of how the cure was worse than the disease. If you were very sick, they'd say, oh, you've got so much blood, we got to let more and more out of you. Of course, this didn't work. It made things worse, but that did not urge doctors to abandon the practice. Instead, they just said, well, we didn't get to you fast enough, or we didn't get enough blood out of you. So rather than take the evidence that this wasn't working as an urge to abandon this practice, instead, doctors just doubled down upon it and became more convinced that bloodletting was the solution, and they would just simply argue that not enough blood had been taken out of you, or they didn't get to you fast enough. And this was not something done in back alleys by quack physicians. This was done by the leading authorities on health in this period, who again had been deeply influenced by medical textbooks written by Benjamin Rush. When George Washington becomes ill and goes to see doctors after his presidency in the latter stage of his life, he's subject to bloodletting, and most historians agree that Washington's death was quickened, advanced, hastened by the treatment that he received. We will talk soon about William Henry Harrison, who is the very first president to die in office. And as part of the treatment that he received in the one and only month that he will be president, that included bloodletting. And again, most historians agree that his death was quickened by the treatment he received. Some historians have argued that Harrison could have recovered and continued with this presidency and not gone down in history as the very first president to die in office. What killed him wasn't the pneumonia, but it was the treatment he received for that pneumonia that included things like bloodletting. And then the second president to die in office, Zachary Taylor, also died as a result of the mistreatment he received. So this form of treatment, bloodletting, was used when the President of the United States fell ill. It wasn't something simply done by quacks in a back alley or through the sale of cuppers and leechers from mail-order catalogs. The most prominent Americans of this age, sitting presidents, who were attended to by physicians, were subject to bloodletting, very common and, of course, very deleterious to health, hastening the death of people like Harrison and Taylor. And again, good evidence for us here of the limits of medical knowledge in this period. Let's talk about medicine, which also is very crude and ineffective in this period. Again, it too was a product of what stood as medical knowledge at this time, the idea of balancing out the different fluids in one's body. And so some of the medicines prescribed in this period were designed to induce vomiting. Plants like lobelia, ipecac, and even tobacco. They would force people to consume tobacco or to smoke tobacco in an effort to make them vomit. So again, imagine you're already sick and the doctor says, well, I know what's going to make you better. Let's make you barf, right? Some of you might have ipecac in your house right now. It's still available as something to induce vomiting. And if you have very small children, sometimes doctors will encourage you to have that in your house because small children like to put things in their mouth and sometimes poison themselves, and you can't rush them to the hospital in time to save them, so you might give them ipecac. So ipecac is still available. I don't know if it's sold over the counter or you have to somehow procure it through a prescription, but you might have some in your house if you have small children. It is a plant extract that induces vomiting. But in this period, it's given to adults who haven't consumed bleach or some sort of toxin as, again, some sort of crude medicine of this period. They would force people to sweat. They would make them wear heavy coats and heavy clothing, put them in steam baths and steam rooms, make them eat hot peppers or hot mustard, all in an effort to, again, balance out the different fluids in one's body. One very common medicine prescribed in the 19th century, in the 1800s, was calomel, which mixed a poison, mercury, with laxatives. So here's a good example of the sort of medicine that prevailed in this period. Let's mix poison with something that's going to make you shit, right, and see what will happen, right? Obviously, this was, again, very deleterious to people's health, and it's all based on this idea that we need to make you barf, sweat, bleed, or shit out whatever terrible stuff is inside you. We need to get you to poop out these toxins to better balance the various harmonies and humors in your body. So, again, the treatment much worse than the disease. I mentioned patent medicines earlier, and there are all kinds of quackery, all kinds of ideas in this period for nonsense magic elixirs, some of them sold in traveling shows or sold at carnivals and other places where people gathered. You would have what was known as a medicine show, where they would come out and sing a song or do a little skit in an effort to grab your attention. And then a pitchman would come out and give his spiel for these products. And then there was a mark in the audience. There was someone in on the ruse who would say, oh, I have this ailment. I haven't been able to walk in 3 years, or I cannot see. And then the pitchman would welcome them up on stage, and they take a chug of the magic elixir, whatever was being sold. And then all of a sudden, the person who had claimed to be unable to walk would dance a little jig, or the person who claimed to be blind would start reading poetry. It was all a work. It was all a manipulation, but it sold a lot of these patent medicines that had no appreciable impact on health and actually were usually very laden with alcohol and therefore would have a deleterious effect on one's health. No regulation as to what could be sold in this period. There's no Food and Drug Administration, no limits whatsoever. In the late 19th century, decades after the period we're examining now, Coca-Cola was first sold with cocaine in it. And they could do that because there was no limit in including things like the cocoa leaf in this case, soda. When soda was first sold in the late 19th century, it was sold exclusively in pharmacies. And it was sold as a tonic, as a healthy beverage. Imagine that, right? Soda being sold as health food. And so Coca-Cola was sold in pharmacies. Its first formulation included cocaine. Pepsi, as the name indicates, was originally designed to cure dyspepsia, having an upset stomach. So soda was being sold as health food in the late 19th century. Coca-Cola contained cocaine. Now, that's a great way to sell some soda, okay? You know, you want people lining up around the block to buy your soda, put some cocaine in there, right? So it was very profitable for the producers of these drinks, but it had a, again, pernicious impact on people's health. And so there were all these patent medicines out there. There were other medicines sold with cryptic names, names that did not seem to indicate what the medicine was for. And a lot of these medicines were designed to treat STDs or to provide an abortifacient that would induce an abortion. One of such medicines was called the Unfortunate's Friend. You know, what the hell does that mean, right? Well, it was a cure for syphilis. And so you learned that if you have that particular malady, you are supposed to ask the druggist, the pharmacist, for the unfortunate's friend. So there are a lot of medicines that were sold in these veiled ways. So you didn't have this embarrassing experience of saying, hey, I need that syphilis be gone. Can you give me some of that, right? You know, instead the medicine was labeled the unfortunate's friend. When you have that unfortunate problem of syphilis, turn to the unfortunate's friend. There were abortifacients sold. One of the products sold that were designed to induce abortions was again labeled in the very cryptic way, Dr. Ralph's aromatic pills. And so you learn that those are the pills that you take to induce an abortion. And women would induce an abortion in this period because childbirth was very dangerous. There was a good likelihood women would die in childbirth. Most Americans are living lives of desperate poverty in this period, and they often could not afford another child. There's no widely available birth control in this period. And so abortifacients were an alternative, along with, of course, surgical abortions, which were common in this period and available. It really isn't until the early 20th century that abortion is criminalized. And then later, of course, in the very late 20th century, you have Roe v. Wade decriminalizing abortion. And so a surgical abortion was also common in this period, in addition to Dr. Ralph's aromatic pills, an abortifacient that, if taken, could induce an abortion and potentially save a woman's life from having to go through the very dangerous experience of childbirth. So we know now, thanks to research, that a lot of these medicines were sold with these cryptic names that did not indicate what they were for, but again, through the grapevine, through word of mouth, you learned that Dr. Ralph's aromatic pills were for abortion, and things like the unfortunate's friend for syphilis. So a smattering of the different medicines in this period, and again, what this tells us is the very crude, limited, ineffective, often pernicious role of medicine in this era. Again, evidence for us of the limits of understanding knowledge in this era of technological change, evidence for us here about why the longevity of this period is so low at about 40 years. Here are a couple of ads from this period. On the left, one of these sort of quack patent medicines that could cure baldness. And so they draw a bald guy, and then they draw a guy with hair, right? See, it worked. This is the before and after pictures before photography. And because it's an illustration, of course, there's no evidence here that this one man actually took these pills and then became, blessed with a full head of hair. Baldness. To this day, there's so many quack things sold to regrow hair, right? This is a way you play on people's sense of anxiety, sense of fear of getting older, and then take their money from them, selling them all kinds of quackery, all kinds of false cures, and this persists to this day with baldness cures and promises to give you six-pack abs, hydroxycut, and all kinds of stuff that, again, doesn't work or turns out to be actually bad for you. We human beings fallen for these messages for centuries, and here's some evidence from the 19th century. On the right, a very common pill that was imagined to have all kinds of healing properties, all kinds of healthy outcomes as a result of taking it, writes Indian vegetable pills. These were made from the husks of corn. They were made from a discarded agricultural product, the husk of a corn. And so they took those husks, they dried them, ground them, and pressed them into pills, and then sold them as medicine. But of course, the husk of corn have no healing vitamin properties. They have no benefit whatsoever. It's just, ground up corn husks. But it was sold as some sort of miracle cure, some sort of wonder under the name of Wright's Indian vegetable pill. So it had no appreciable effect. There was no healthy outcome, no healthy benefit to taking a pill made up of ground corn husks. And so it didn't help you. And it was a great, of course, boon to the people who produced this medicine that they could sell as something healthy, even though it had no healing properties whatsoever. And you can get away with that because, again, no regulation of medicine in this era. So people were being fleeced. People were being subject to all kinds of cons and flim-flam artists selling cures for cancer, cures for baldness, magic pills that will make you healthy that really had no healthy benefits whatsoever. And we might be inclined to chuckle at this and look back on history. Those people are such dupes and fools, but this continues to this day. There are all kinds of wackadoo things sold over the internet now with promises to make you cure. There's all kinds of prominent individuals who have podcasts who tell you these magic cures and other things you could take. So we shouldn't be so inclined towards laughing at Americans of this era who were captive to bad advice, bad information, the profit motive, and the way in which people made money off of this, because it continues to this day. There are all kinds of flim-flam artists out there today, all kinds of con artists. In the last few decades of the late 20th and early 21st century, there's been a great relaxing of regulations in regards to what can be sold and marketed. And there might be a product you buy, that you take, that you believe is making you healthy, which will later turn out to be nonsense. And how would you want your grandkids to think of you? As a fool, as a dupe? No, probably not. And therefore, we shouldn't think of the Americans of this era as fools and dupes. They were, again, captive to a marketplace that was completely unregulated, that often took advantage of them in this fashion. This is a period where there's no knowledge of germ theory. There's no understanding of proper sanitary conditions. What prevailed was medieval thinking, which included the idea of balancing the four humors in one's body, but also the miasma theory of disease, which was the idea that disease is a function of smelling bad things, that if you smell bad air, you'll get sick. And so burning of incense was very common in this period, heavy perfumes, all kinds of efforts to try to cover up this stink that was everywhere in this period, because bathing was rare. Most Americans only bathed once or twice a year in rural areas. In urban areas, you might have a chance to take more baths because bathhouses were very common in urban areas, places where you could go public baths. A lot of homes in this period, tenement buildings, did not have running water, and so people bathed in public bathhouses. And that was more common in urban areas, but in rural areas without access to running water or running water being scarce, you only took a bath once or twice a year. So people were filthy in this period, and they lived in filth and squalor. In urban areas, none of the niceties that we take for granted today, where you can wheel your little green, your little blue, and your little black trash cans to the curb once a week, and magic presto, someone comes and takes all your shit away from you, and you start over nice and clean for the next week. That doesn't happen in New York City, in Boston, and Philadelphia. In the early to mid 19th century, there's no garbage service. People just piled their crap everywhere. They threw it in the alley. And no sewage service. And so people pissed and shit right there in the streets. There were often no running water in toilets in people's homes, and so they pissed and shit in chamber pots, where right there in the middle of your apartment, you pissed and shit right there in front of mom, dad, the kids, the whole family, and then you threw it out the window. They would have, outhouses in certain areas with these large apartment buildings, tenement buildings, where people would do their business outside. But then when it rained, the outhouses would overflow, and that turd you launched last week would come back and say, "Hi, how you doing?" Right? So there was filth and shit everywhere in this period, without garbage collection, without sewage, without running water. As a result, wild animals roamed the streets of New York and Boston and Philadelphia, subsisting off of the filth, the trash that was everywhere. Wild boars, wild hogs roamed the streets of New York and attacked people when they couldn't find enough trash to subsist off of. This is well before the advent of automobiles and subways and trolley cars. So the main way people got around in Boston, in Philadelphia, in New York, in these growing, teeming urban areas was with horses. And if you've ever been around a horse, you know that they are very productive when it comes to shit, right? They just shit everywhere. The tail goes up and the poop goes flying, right? So there's human waste everywhere, and there's animal waste everywhere. And it's no surprise, therefore, as a result, that epidemics were very common in this period. Pandemics of diseases spreading, cholera because of contaminated drinking water, yellow fever, smallpox, tuberculosis. So this too plays a role in the very short lifespans of this period. People lived in filth and squalor, no sewage, no waste or garbage, sanitation services in this period, access to clean water, people bathing rarely. And so, again, very good evidence for us here of the limits of technological change in this period, the limits of advancement. Yeah, it might be an age of railroads, steamboats, but it's still an age where people are living in filth and squalor and dying at the age of 40. It's a period where we're not improving urban life, even as cities are growing, where there's no knowledge of germ theory. What's the takeaway from all this? Be happy you're alive in the 21st century. You know, look, I know we are facing some major problems right now in our lives, and there's grounds to be worried and pessimistic about our lives today and the future. But despite that, be grateful you're alive in the 21st century. The past is not a romantic wonderland. It's a pretty miserable place that you might want to fear ever being part of, because, again, people lived in filth and squalor. They worked 6 days a week. They were in deep debt and poverty. And you have none of the amenities we associate with modern life here in 19th century America. Let's conclude this lecture with one last and perhaps most troubling example of the limits of knowledge in this period even though it's an age of technological change and advancement. We're sort of balancing these two lectures here, where the first lecture I gave on technology, tinkerers, and transformation testified to the remarkable changes of this period, but here we've learned about the limits of it, particularly in regards to health and medicine, and further evidence of the limited understanding in this period. The way in which a pseudo-false science manifests in this period rather than a true science can be seen in the fad of phrenology, which was a very popular scientific theory in the 1830s, 1840s, 1850s. And it argued that you could understand people based on examination of the skull. Phrenologists were people who claimed to be scientists, doctors, who would use calipers and other measuring devices to measure one's skull, to map one's skull, to chart the bumps you had on your skull. And they argued that the measurement of the skull, the mapping, charting of the skull, the different bumps you might have on your head corresponded to things like one's intelligence, one's morality, one's mental health. All of this is quackery. All of this is bullshit. All of this is nonsense. But it prevailed in this period. The idea that you could understand human beings, their morality, their inclination towards criminality, their intelligence based on this measurement and examination of the skull that revealed intelligence, revealed morality, revealed whether or not they would be inclined towards being a criminal or whether they would be good, moral, upright citizens. The chief popularizers of phrenology were brothers Orson and Lorenzo Fowler, who published a number of books and charts on phrenology, sold them, and offered their study, their science, as, again, an explanation for the problems of humanity. Why are some people criminals? Why are some people less intelligent than others? Why are some people more successful? Well, it can all be answered by the bumps on their skull. And so they sold these books, they sold these charts, and they became very common in American life. When you went to go see a doctor in the 1840s, 1850s, he might have a phrenology chart. We'll take a look at one in just a moment, on the wall of his office. And if you were complaining about some sort of malady, if you were feeling under the weather, depressed, he would start to examine your skull and try to divine from your skull why you may be suffering from those maladies. So the Fowler brothers made a lot of money selling these books and charts and helping to popularize this false science, this pseudoscience of phrenology. Here is the aforementioned chart of someone's skull, someone's brain, and if you look very closely here, the idea is that different parts of your skull correspond to different parts of your personality. And so you have, again, this idea of cautiousness or hope or benevolence, right? If that part of your skull was seen as big and pronounced, well, you have those traits. And then, other parts of your skull are big and pronounced, well, you have those traits. So this looks to us like something bizarre and strange, a weird relic, and it is. It's a weird relic of the 19th century, and this chart, again, sold by the Fowler brothers and others, would be very commonplace in America and used as diagnostics, used as a way of trying to understand people's behavior, their illnesses, this solution to the problems that plagued humanity, all to be found by, again, this pseudoscience, this false science of looking at someone's skull, measuring different elements of one's skull, and then arriving at scientific conclusions. But really, phrenology took off because it was a way of reinforcing racist beliefs. Phrenologists argued that through their techniques of examining and measuring skulls, they could prove the superiority of the white race. They could prove that African Americans were inherently biologically inferior. And that's why I said of all the different elements of the limits of knowledge in this period that we're examining, from bloodletting to crude and ineffective medicine to, in many ways, the ways in which diets remained unhealthy in this period, phrenology is the most pernicious element of the lack of understanding and knowledge and science in this period. It wasn't just quackery. It wasn't just a false science. It was used to undergird white supremacy and racism, because phrenologists argued that their scientific study of the skull revealed that whites were superior. And then they promulgated that belief. They argued that when you examine the head of white people, you see all of this evidence of why they are more intelligent, more moral. And when you study the heads of African Americans, you see all this evidence that they are less intelligent, less moral, inclined towards criminality. And phrenology became part of the way in which Southerners argued for slavery. It became yet another pro-slavery argument that science has proven that African Americans cannot be equal to whites, and they must be subject to slavery and bondage, because if they were ever free, they would be violent and licentious and unable to be free individuals in a free society, that they lacked these physical characteristics. This is the beginning of what is known as race science, which is racism for intellectuals, which is the use of science and other intellectual pursuits to justify racism. Race science, phrenology, these have no scientific basis whatsoever. They have been thoroughly discredited. There is no scientific evidence that one race is superior to another. That is pseudoscience, that is false science. But with the development of scientific thinking in the modern era, there was an effort to take science and use it to justify racism. And so you have race science, and phrenology is an early example of it. It was used to justify slavery. It was used to justify wars of aggression against Native Americans in the 19th century. It was used to justify the efforts to war against Native Americans and dispossess them of their land and lock millions of people into a system of human bondage. And that's why, again, this is not just simply evidence of the limited scientific knowledge of people in this period. There's very real, very troubling, very pernicious impacts of phrenology. In the late 19th century, this would branch out into social Darwinism, which was a misapplication of Darwin's theories, a bastardization of Darwin's theories, a wrong-headed false use of Darwin's ideas that argued that, well, some are superior to others, survival of the fittest, and social Darwinists always argued that whites were inherently more fit than non-whites, and social Darwinism in the late 1800s would be used to justify segregation, discrimination against racial minorities in this country. It would be used to call for efforts to limit immigration to the United States. It was used to justify colonialism, imperialism, efforts to conquer parts of Africa, Asia, Latin America. So again, millions of lives were adversely affected by the false pseudoscience of social Darwinism that comes out of phrenology. And then in the early 20th century, you had eugenics, this belief, again, in genetic supremacy, which led to immigration restrictions, led to forcible sterilization laws, where people were forcibly sterilized. Between 1904 and 1963, over 64,000 Americans were forcibly sterilized by their government. And that was upheld by the U.S. Supreme Court in 1927 in a landmark Supreme Court decision. So what began with phrenology continued with social Darwinism into the 20th century. Eugenicists in America in the early 20th century inspired and influenced Adolf Hitler. In fact, if you read, I don't advise doing this, but as you're a historian, you sometimes have to read these things. If you read Hitler's Mein Kampf, he praises the United States for its use of eugenics, and that later inspired things like the Holocaust and Hitler's efforts to exterminate Jews and other ethnic, religious, sexual minorities in Nazi Germany. Millions of people killed. So phrenology is certainly evidence for us here of the limits of understanding in this period. The big theme in the second look at Tinker's Technology and Transformation, how this isn't an age of further knowledge, as we've seen in terms of health, bloodletting, quack patent medicines. But phrenology is different than those earlier examples that we offered, because not only is this evidence of the lack of understanding knowledge of humanity in this period, it's one that has a very terrible effect in justifying racism, wars against Native Americans, later inspiring social Darwinism, and justifying colonialism, racism, lynchings, racialized violence, eugenics, forcible sterilization, inspiring Hitler and the Holocaust. So phrenology is the beginning of a long and terrible legacy, many of which continue sadly to this day, where people tried to justify racism through science. So in the second lecture here, we've talked about the limits of science technology in an age that is still marked by a remarkable transformation, testifying to the complexity of this period where, yes, it is an age of remarkable transformation, but Americans still either believe very false and pernicious things like phrenology, or are captive to a limited knowledge in regards to medicine and health.